Scottish comic book writer who's most famous for working with Marvel and his own Millar comic book imprint. So he started out like a lot of great writers, working for 2000 AD here in Britain, and he quickly made a name for himself amongst writers and got the attention of DC and Marvel, in particular DC Comics, who immediately commissioned him to write for them. So he did a couple of little things, and then he got his first big break of doing his own limited short story arc, which was Superman Red Sun. So his idea was he was going to write something that had nothing to do with the canon, with the established universe. He was going to write a one-off story that was entirely his own imagination, but used DC characters. And Superman Red Sun is incredible. It's the idea of what if Superman's rocket landed in Russia instead of America? What would happen 30 years later when he grows up, 40 years later, 50 years later? But it's not just a one-trick pony. The entire story is absolutely solid. It's got so many twists and turns. It introduces the entire Justice League in completely new forms. It's such an incredibly well put together story. It's very controversial. It really messes with the DC universe and is also quite political, which is absolutely Mark Millar's style. But it's still a solid story, which is why it works so well. But DC, the one thing you can always say about DC is they don't like controversy. And I don't know if he'd already come up with his idea for Wanted and presented it to them or not. But around the time that Red Sun had come out, he left DC. Whether he quit or they fired him, I don't know. But we're all better for it because the work he did afterwards has far, far eclipsed that. So one of the first things he did after DC was he wrote Wanted. And Wanted is this amazing metaphor in which he creates a world where the DC supervillains have won and they've destroyed all of the DC superheroes. Now, because he didn't work for DC, because it was an original piece, he changed all of the characters slightly and gave them new names. But basically there's three factions in the world of villainy, and it's Batman's Rogues Gallery, Superman's Rogues Gallery, and then I think it's kind of like a Marvel Rogues Gallery. So they exist on these three different continents in the world, and they basically control the world. And you follow this character who kind of learns about this whole subculture, encounters all these different characters, and then is there when this big conflict occurs between these three kind of great superpowers, or super-villainous powers. But his interpretation of the DC villain rogues canon is incredible. All the characters are as extreme as you'd ever want them to be, and they do the things you've always wanted them to do if you're an adult and you're into comics. Definitely something to check out, possibly one of the best things he ever wrote. It's in my top 3 things of Mark Millar's work. Utterly incredible. So then he got the job with Marvel, and straight away he started making quality work for Marvel. He did Ultimate X-Men and made it a huge kind of industry. His stories were the ones that were bestsellers. And again, he did the same thing. It's a bit like Jeff Johns. He took the story, he wiped the slate clean, and he built the new thing up again. And that's kind of the real strength of Mark Millar. And nothing is more of an illustration of that than his Ultimates. So Ultimates 1 and Ultimates 2. He essentially came up with his own story, his own superhero team story, that had a beginning, middle and end, a classic 3-act play, and then he essentially cherry-picked characters from the DC universe to fit the roles he already had, rather than trying to take characters that already existed and get a story to weave amongst all of these different characters. It's such a solid story, and it's such a pure reimagination of the Marvel universe. It's just incredible. It lent itself so well to a movie, and here we are. There's already been one Avengers movie, and all these Marvel movies are so Mark Millar. It's unbelievable. So his Ultimate X-Men was like that. His Ultimates was like that. A lot of that kind of work he did. But he also did some mainstream stuff, and his main thing for Marvel's mainstream was Civil War. The great thing about Civil War was how he attached his version of reality to the comic, and his realism in that is incredible. It begins with a reality TV show involving superheroes, and there's loads of other modern day references, but they just seamlessly fit into the story. It's such a great modern grown-up political story that also has twists and turns and action and suspense, all the classic things that Mark Millar's so good at. He did another great comic for Marvel, which is Old Man Logan, which is definitely something you need to check out. That is my favourite Mark Millar story. It's up there with my top three. It's Old Man Logan, Wanted, and I would say Ultimates 1. Old Man Logan is a bit like what he was trying to do with DC. He came up with his own fantasy idea where he did whatever he wanted with the Marvel characters, and he set it, I think it's like 20 or 30 years in the future, where all the Marvel heroes have been killed by all the Marvel villains, and the villains rule the world, and Wolverine is the only one left who still has some fight in him. But it was such a grown-up story, so political and so violent, but doing everything you've always wanted to see your heroes do, but they never actually do because comics are written for kids or whatever. I mean, that was what was so great about it. So after that, he's kind of steadily gone on with Marvel, and he still works for Marvel now and writes some great comics. But he really made his name as an independent comic book writer as well, and his Millarworld stuff is really where his kind of all of his strength goes now. So obviously it began with Wanted, and then they made the movie of Wanted. But then the real success came with Kick-Ass, and the movie of Kick-Ass, which has been massive, and he's written Kick-Ass 2 and Hit Girl. But this is the thing, he still keeps coming up with these new ideas that are just as good. Like, even though it's great to read Kick-Ass 2, I'd say that stuff like Superior, Nemesis, and Super Crooks, and Secret Service are just as good as Kick-Ass and Wanted, and I'd rather have a series of these one-off stories than keep going with getting Kick-Ass 3 maybe, and Hit Girl, and if he's going to make a Superior 2 or a Nemesis 2. Like, I mean, those are great, and he is a great writer, and it's great to have those characters carry on. But it's also, the best thing about him is that his original ideas that he keeps coming up with are just absolutely solid. So this is my Mark Millar collection.
So first up I've got, this is The Authority from Wildstorm, and he wrote the second story in this volume. The first one's by Warren Ellis, which I might do another video on at some other point. It's pretty good, but it's not as good as Warren Ellis's stories. So then I have got, starting with Red Sun, which, like I said, is absolutely amazing. You've got to check this out. It's a great place to start with Mark Millar. It's a really, really great comic. Just put that back. So next up, I got Wanted. It's really hard to get hold of a copy that's not the movie tie-in. So this actually cost me quite a bit of money, but it's such a great story. It's so fantastic. It's just completely controversial. It's really gory, really extreme, but it's exactly what you want. It's brilliant. So then I've got the Ultimates, which is the Ultimate Universe version of the Avengers. He basically did a part one and part two, like two movies. So this is Ultimates in two volumes. I think you can probably get a collected version now. It is really, really good. And he had the artist make all of the characters look like famous celebrities in it. So then the only X-Men I've got of his is volume 5 because it's a tie-in with the Ultimates, which is why I went for it. But it's really good. I'm not so keen on his version of the X-Men, but I really love his version of the Avengers. So kind of around that time, because he was working for Marvel on both universes, he wrote Civil War. Civil War is amazing, but it is in canon with the normal universe. So if you don't follow the normal universe, it can be a bit confusing. So I wouldn't recommend you start with that unless you're already into standard Marvel comics. But it is really good. So then obviously Ultimates 2, the sequel to Ultimates in 2 volumes. This one is really, really good as well. It's got like a huge fold-out panel at the back. It's like 6 pages long. It's quite famous for it. It's a great story. It's really good. It's quite similar to the movie, that one. So then, like I said, one of my favourites, Old Man Logan. It's very similar to Wanted, like the same kind of idea, but again, it's just so satisfying. It's just a really, really great story. Definitely worth it. It costs a lot of money, but it's actually worth it. So this one's kind of cool. This is another one-off he did for Marvel. It's about a little boy in the 80s, and he notices the Marvel heroes and villains coming into the real world, but it's actually got a really personal story that's the main story, and it makes it an amazing comic. Definitely worth checking out. This one's a bit weird. I don't really get it. He's only done like one volume. It's tiny. It's only three or four comics long. So I'd recommend with this one, wait until more come out before you think about it, because it is a bit odd. So then next I got Kick-Ass, which is now incredibly famous because of the movie. The comic is different. It's a different story. Like different people die or not die in it. So it's definitely worth checking out the comic. I prefer the comic, but the movie is still very good. And then obviously that makes Kick-Ass 2 even more different from Kick-Ass 2 the movie. Very, very different. Um, Kick-Ass 2 is really good. Should definitely check that out. I love Nemesis. Nemesis, the idea is, what if Batman was a baddie? He would just be unstoppable. It is so good. And then Superiors is alright. It's about a little boy who becomes a superhero, kind of like Shazam, and just the kind of moral implications of that. But it's kind of cool for a one-off thing. And then Super Crooks is like Ocean's 11, but with super villains. Again, it's really good. There's a new one out, which is Secret Service, which I haven't got yet. But like I said, these ones, they are really good, and they're worth reading in sequence, basically. So yeah, that's my Mark Millar collection.